The village of Ashgrave was a hollow shell of what it once was, a place where time seemed to hold its breath. The air was thick, not with mist but with something far more oppressive, as if the atmosphere itself carried a grudge. The villagers, those few who dared remain, whispered of the burning shadows, a phenomenon that had driven most of the population to flee or worse. It began 3 years ago, on the coldest night of winter. A young blacksmith, Eric, had been the first to see it. He claimed to have noticed something unnatural flickering against the wall of his forge, even though no fire was lit. He described it as a shadow without a source, dancing erratically as if alive. But what made his skin crawl was its heat. Shadows, cold and intangible by nature, had no reason to radiate warmth, let alone burn his skin when he dared to touch it. Eric's story was dismissed at first. Drunken ramblings, the elders said. But then it happened again and again. The next incident involved a farmer, Thaddeus, who stumbled home late from the tavern. His family found him the next morning, lying face down in the snow, his back seared with blackened handprints. He never spoke again. What followed was worse than any fever dream. Shadows began to crawl, their movements defying logic. They slipped from the corners of rooms, elongated across walls, and even formed under midday sunlight. They would writhe like living things, curling around objects, caressing them before leaving them charred and smoking. Livestock found within their grasp turned to heaps of ash, and those few villagers unlucky enough to be ensnared were never the same. Young Ada, the baker's daughter, was among the first to survive an encounter. She came running from the woods one evening, screaming incoherently, her arms covered in burns that oozed blackened pus. "They laugh," she sobbed over and over. "They laugh when they touch you." Her hair, once golden as wheat, was streaked with gray. She refused to enter dark rooms, even during daylight, and clawed at her skin as if trying to rid herself of something unseen. The village priest, Father Yorick, sought answers in scripture, though he found none. He began performing blessings, sprinkling holy water at every corner of Ashgrave, but it was like spitting at a wildfire. The shadows grew bolder, their heat intensifying, until one dreadful night when the entire chapel erupted into flames. Witnesses swore they saw the shadows convulse in delight as the sacred building crumbled into soot. By the time the mayor called for help from the outside world, it was too late. Those who arrived were met with a haunting sight: scorched earth in the shape of human figures, burned into the cobblestones, and walls etched with strange, jagged symbols. The smell of burnt flesh lingered in the air, even though no bodies were ever found. Despite the danger, a group of villagers, led by Marlowe, a grizzled woodsman who claimed the shadows feared the light of fire, gathered one fateful evening to confront the phenomenon. They armed themselves with torches, kindling, and bottles of oil. The plan was simple: drive the shadows back into whatever abyss they came from. But as they ventured into the heart of the woods where the shadows seemed to spawn, they found something that turned their blood to ice. The clearing was littered with charred remnants of animals and trees, but at its center stood a massive, writhing form of pure darkness. It pulsed, almost like a heartbeat, and the surrounding air shimmered with an unbearable heat. As they approached, they saw faces within the shadows, faces they recognized. Former villagers, their expressions twisted in agony and malevolence, mouths opening and closing as if they were trying to scream. The shadows whispered to them, words that no one could later recall, but that struck deep into their souls. One man dropped his torch and fell to his knees, his eyes rolling back as his skin began to blacken and flake away. The others were frozen in place, their resolve crumbling as the shadows closed in, their laughter echoing like a death knell. The burning had only just begun. The night swallowed the forest whole, and the villagers in Marlowe's group felt the weight of their choices as the writhing mass of shadows loomed before them. The oppressive heat made the air shimmer, and the acrid stench of burning flesh clung to their nostrils. Their torches, once symbols of defiance, flickered weakly, as if the fire itself were afraid to burn in the presence of such malevolence. Marlowe stood at the front, sweat pouring down his weathered face. His grip on the torch was white-knuckled, his knotted muscles taut with fear. "Hold your ground," he barked, though his voice cracked, betraying his own doubt. The others, Ada's father, a frail tailor named Colm, a farmhand called Petra, and 3 others whose names barely mattered now, stood behind him, trembling. From the pulsating mass of shadows, one of the twisted faces peeled itself free. It slithered forward, still attached to the writhing darkness by long tendrils. The face was unmistakable. Eric, the blacksmith. His features were stretched, distorted, and his eyes, once sharp and full of life, were now burning coals. "Eric," Marlowe called out, stepping forward instinctively. The others hissed at him to stay back, but his boots crunched on the scorched earth as he closed the distance. "If you're in there, fight it. Fight it, damn you." The shadow Eric opened its mouth wide, impossibly wide, until it was nothing but a gaping void. From it poured a sound. No, not a sound, but a sensation that clawed at their sanity. It was laughter, wet and gurgling, layered over screams that echoed as if from the depths of a chasm. The group staggered back, hands pressed to their ears, but it was futile. The noise wasn't external. It burrowed into their skulls, a parasite gnawing at their minds. Colm fell first, his torch clattering to the ground as he clawed at his own face. "Get them out! Get them out of my head!" he shrieked before collapsing into convulsions. His body began to smolder, black veins spider webbing beneath his skin until he erupted into ash. The others broke. Petra turned and ran, her sobs swallowed by the oppressive darkness. One of the others followed, disappearing into the trees, their torchlight fading into the abyss. Only Marlowe and Ada's father remained. Marlowe turned to the man. "You've got to run. Take Ada and get as far from Ashgrave as you can." "I'll..." "Do what?" The man interrupted, his voice brutal. "Burn with the rest of this cursed place." Before Marlowe could respond, the shadows surged forward. Tendrils lashed out, snuffing out the man's torch in an instant. He screamed, flailing as the shadows coiled around him, dragging him toward the writhing mass. His voice was cut off abruptly as his body ignited, a blinding flash of heat and light that left only scorched footprints where he had stood. Marlowe swung his torch wildly, the flames licking harmlessly at the encroaching darkness. "Is this all you've got?" he roared, his voice hoarse. "Come on, I'm not afraid of you." The shadows responded by whispering his name, not in unison, but in dozens of voices, young and old, male and female, familiar and alien. Each syllable felt like a dagger piercing his ears. The tendrils circled him, tightening their noose, and Marlowe knew he wouldn't survive. But he had to try. With a roar, he hurled his torch into the heart of the writhing mass. The shadows recoiled momentarily, their pulsations slowing as if startled. Marlowe seized the opportunity, dashing toward the edge of the clearing. His lungs burned as he ran, his boots slipping on scorched roots and brittle leaves. Behind him, the laughter grew louder, more guttural, until it felt as though it were coming from within his own chest. He burst from the forest and collapsed onto the frostbitten earth, gasping for air. The village lay before him, eerily silent and bathed in the faint glow of the moon. But the silence was wrong, too complete. He staggered to his feet, his body trembling, and stumbled toward the square. It was deserted. The air smelled of soot and decay. He called out, but his voice echoed unanswered. Houses were dark, their doors swinging open as though the inhabitants had fled mid-flight. And then he saw them, shadows, moving unnaturally, slithering across the cobblestones toward the town hall. They merged and split, writhing like serpents, but their heat was unmistakable. They didn't just burn, they consumed. Marlowe followed, helpless to resist, until he reached the hall's entrance. Inside, the room was lit by an unnatural glow. The writhing mass had grown, stretching from floor to ceiling, consuming the walls. The faces were there, dozens of them now, the entire village trapped within its pulsating horror. Marlowe's knees buckled, and he dropped to the ground. "Why?" he whispered, his voice breaking. The shadows didn't answer with words, but he understood. It was a hunger, a primal, insatiable hunger that fed on fear, pain, and flesh. And it wasn't confined to Ashgrave. The tendrils stretched toward him, curling lovingly around his ankles, his wrists. He didn't resist. What was left to fight for? As the searing heat consumed him, Marlowe's final thought was not of despair but of a single, chilling realization. The shadows were spreading. Marlowe's scream was short-lived, choked off as the searing tendrils wrapped around his throat. Yet, in those final moments, something flickered deep within him, a spark of stubborn defiance that refused to let the shadows take him quietly. His mind burned with memories of Ash Grave before the darkness. Children laughing in the square, the golden fields swaying in the summer wind, the warmth of the hearth in his small home. That spark ignited something more, a fierce, primal urge to resist, not for himself, but for those who might still live beyond the cursed village. The shadows convulsed, tightening their grip as if sensing his rebellion. They dragged him closer to the mass, their heat blistering his skin and filling the air with the stench of charred flesh. Faces writhed within the darkness, their expressions twisted with agony and malice. But Marlowe saw something else in their burning eyes, the faintest flicker of humanity. The trapped souls, they were still in there, buried beneath layers of torment. Marlowe gritted his teeth and let out a guttural roar, wrenching his arm free from the shadow's grip. His flesh sizzled where the tendrils had touched, but he barely noticed. His hand closed around a broken piece of timber near the hall's entrance. The wood was dry, brittle, and splintered, useless as a weapon, but perfect for a flame. With trembling hands, he struck his belt knife against a shard of flint he always carried, sending sparks onto the timber. The first few attempts failed as the oppressive heat seemed to swallow the sparks, but finally, a tiny ember took hold. The flame grew, feeding on the dry wood, and Marlowe held the improvised torch high. The shadows recoiled, their tendrils snapping back like wounded serpents. The faces within the darkness screamed silently, their mouths gaping as though they felt the pain of the light. Marlowe staggered forward, thrusting the flame toward the writhing mass. "You don't take us," he bellowed, his voice raw. "Not all of us." The flame licked the edge of the shadows, and for the first time, the mass shuddered violently. The writhing tendrils began to dissolve, curling away like smoke in the wind. The faces flickered, their agonized expressions softening into something like relief. Marlowe pressed on, the torch growing dimmer as the fire consumed the timber. The mass began to collapse inward, folding into itself like a dying star. The oppressive heat dissipated, replaced by an icy chill. Marlowe felt the weight lifting from his chest, the suffocating whispers fading into silence. But as the mass shrank, the laughter returned, not the guttural mockery from before, but something colder, more calculated. "You think you've won," it hissed, the voice emerging from the last sliver of shadow. It no longer sounded like many voices, but one, a voice that was both ancient and eerily familiar. "We are not bound to one place, one village. We are hunger, we are fire, and we are everywhere." With a final, explosive burst of heat, the last remnants of the shadow vanished, leaving Marlowe alone in the charred ruins of the town hall. He dropped the torch, now nothing more than a smoldering stub, and collapsed to his knees. The village was deathly quiet. No more shadows writhed in the streets. No faces screamed silently from the walls. Ash Grave was empty, a burned husk of its former self. Marlowe staggered to his feet, his body battered, and his spirit frayed, but alive. He turned toward the forest, knowing there was nothing left for him here. As he walked, the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, painting the world in soft hues of gold and pink. But the warmth of the sun brought no comfort. Marlowe could still feel the lingering heat on his skin, the ghostly touch of the burning shadows. And deep in his heart, he knew the truth. The shadows were not gone. They had retreated, biding their time, spreading to new places, hungering for new victims. Somewhere, another village would fall silent, its people consumed by darkness. And Marlowe? He would be there to warn them, to fight, though he knew the odds were slim. Because once the shadows touched you, they never truly let go. As he disappeared into the forest, a faint shadow flickered on the path behind him, following his every step.